In this video, I am going to show you the 10 steps you need to follow to start your podcast. Let's dive right in. Hi there, welcome to the Quick Launch podcasting channel. My name is Oumar. If this is your first time here, this is the channel where we teach entrepreneurs, small business owners, and coaches how to launch their podcasts in less time. And today I am going to share with you the 10 steps you need to follow to launch your podcast. Let's get started. Step number 1, pick a topic. The way you pick a topic is you select a topic based on your expertise or your knowledge or even your hobbies, things that you're good at. This could be your day job, this could be something you learned at school, this could be something that you are passionate about, it could be a hobby. Another way you can select your podcast topic is by doing some research. You can go on Google, for example, on Google Trends, and do some research on some of the popular topics that are of interest to people, and pick 3 to 5 topics that you want to start your podcast about. Now, as you pick your topic, you need to figure out what niche or category your podcast falls under. Is it health and wellness? Is it for fitness? Is it on motivation? Is it on nursing? Is it on underwater basket weaving? You are going to need to figure out what category or niche your podcast falls under, because you will need to know that information to be able to submit your podcast later on. Step number 2, get your podcast details. You are going to need a podcast title, a podcast description, and a podcast cover art. Ideally, your title should be relatively short and it should relate to the topic of your podcast that you selected in step number 1. And when it comes to your podcast cover, it's going to be the first thing that people see when they browse through the podcast directory. So you need to make sure that your cover looks very professional, that it relates to your topic, that people can tell from just looking at the cover what your podcast is about. Because believe it or not, people will judge your podcast by its cover. You are also going to need a podcast description. This is a must before you can submit your podcast. So make sure you write a description that is enticing, that will draw in your ideal listener. Step number 3, get your podcast equipment. At a minimum, you are going to need a microphone if you're doing an audio podcast. If you are doing a video podcast, you are going to need a microphone and a camera. Now, if you are doing an audio podcast, it is recommended to have not only a microphone but also a webcam, so that you can actually leverage that footage and put it on YouTube if you choose to do so later on. As for the microphone, you are going to need to use either a USB microphone or an XLR microphone. My advice is to keep it very, very simple. Use a USB microphone, and later on you can always upgrade to a fancier microphone. But you can find a very, very cheap USB microphone that does the job and that has good audio. You can check in the chat for a list of podcast equipment if you're interested in figuring out what to use and you just are not sure where to go in terms of equipment. Check out the link in the description. It will direct you to what type of equipment that you can use. But at a minimum, you are going to need a microphone and a webcam. If you are going to focus on a video podcast and visuals are important to you, you are going to need to level up and purchase a camera that's a little more expensive, maybe with a lens. And you can find many videos on YouTube that will tell you how to do that. But check out the equipment list that I have in the description. There's a link in the description that you can check out that will help you out if you're not sure where to start when it comes to podcasting equipment. Step number 4, find guests. Now, this step is optional because if you are going to be doing a solo podcast, solo meaning that you are the only one who is ever going to be speaking on your podcast, then you don't need to have guests. You don't need to find guests. But if you are going to interview guests on your podcast, even if it's just temporarily here and there, you really should look at lining up guests ahead of time. Now, there are a few ways that you can do this. What I would recommend to do is you can go on social media and find celebrities or people that you want to interview. They don't have to be celebrities, and reach out to them through their DMs. You can go on Facebook, on Snapchat, TikTok. Reach out to those people that you want to interview that fit your topic, that are experts in the topic of your podcast, and send them a DM. Very, very often, I would say 80 to 90% of the time, they will say yes, because those people want to get in front of as many audiences as they can so that they can spread their message or sell their products or services. So that's one way of doing it, is to reach out through social media. Another way of finding guests is that when you are at an event, a conference, a seminar, a webinar, you can reach out to those speakers who are maybe in a panel and ask them if they are interested to be on your podcast. And again, in most cases, they will say yes. And if they say no, the worst thing that could happen is that they say no, and that's not going to kill you. Now, there's an easy way to find podcast guests where instead of you reaching out to people, people will actually come to you in droves wanting to be on your podcast. I do talk about that in my podcast course, which is in the description. The link is in the description. If you want to check it out, it will give you details on how to do that. Step number 5, record your podcast episodes. Now, there are many platforms that you can use to record your podcast episodes. When it comes to recording your podcast episode, what I would recommend you to do is to turn on your video camera and ask your guest to do the same if you are going to have a guest, because you could later leverage that video to put it on platforms like YouTube to grow your audience. Now, when it comes to recording your podcast episodes, there are many platforms that you can use. You can use Riverside, Squadcast, Zencaster, or even Zoom. Now, I would not recommend Zoom because the quality is not the same as, let's say, a Riverside or Zencaster. However, if you have no other choice but use Zoom, that is better than nothing. That is better than being stuck and never starting your podcast. I will drop the links to these platforms that I mentioned in the description so you can check them out. By the way, if you are interested in learning more about how to launch your podcast, I do have a free course that you can take at your own time. I will put the link in the description for those who are interested in watching it. Now back to the training. Step number 6, edit your recorded videos. Now, there are many tools out there that you can use. Some are free, some are paid. You could use Audacity for Mac and PC. You could use GarageBand for Mac. You could also use Adobe Audition, Hindenberg, and the list goes on and on. There are many tools that you can use. But for simplicity's sake, I've been using Audacity for many years on my podcast, and it does the trick just fine. The key is to not get stuck trying to figure out what tool to use. Just pick one and go. And if you want something free, you can use Audacity or GarageBand. Step number 7, get a podcast hosting platform. What's a hosting platform or a media host? It has many names. Essentially, a hosting platform is a place where you can store the recorded podcast files and podcast episodes. Now, you might be asking, why can't I just put that on my Google Drive or on my own website? Well, 2 reasons why. Number 1, you are going to need a special link that will be generated by your podcast host. So you can't just go directly on a Google Drive or on your podcast. It would be very difficult, it would be very technical for you to get your own link, which is called an RSS feed. Now, the second reason is that if you were to put that on your website, let's say you had a feed or you had something on your website and these files on your website, you would pay a lot of money because the more people access those files, the more bandwidth you use. And that could easily cost a lot of money as you go on and as more people discover your podcast. So that is why you have to use a podcast host. Now, there are many of them out there. There are dozens upon dozens. But the 2 that I would recommend are Libsyn and Buzzsprout. So if you had to pick one, I would recommend that you use either one of those. Now, you can use Spotify for podcasters, which is free. It used to be called Anchor, but Spotify bought out Anchor, and now it's called Spotify for podcasters. So you could use either of those depending on your budget, depending on what you are able to do. But my recommendation is to use either Buzzsprout or Libsyn. And I'll drop the link in the description for you to go directly to those podcast platforms. Step number 8, upload your podcast episodes to your host. In step number 7, you got a host. And in step number 8, you need to upload the episodes that you recorded to that host. It's very simple to do. If you've ever attached a file to an email, you know how to do that. Essentially, when you log into your host platform, you will see some type of button that says new episode or add episode, depending on the host. And when you click on that, it will allow you to navigate to your podcast recordings on your computer or somewhere else in the cloud and upload them to your podcast host. Now, there's a few more things you need to do, like adding a title, description, so that your listeners know what they're looking at. And once you do that, your episodes are now available in your podcast host and ready to be used. Step number 9, submit your podcast to podcast directories. What are podcast directories? Podcast directories are the places where people would go to find podcast episodes and podcasts. So an example would be Apple Podcasts, which used to be called iTunes, Google Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, this step is absolutely crucial for you to do, because without doing this step, your podcast is not available to be listened to. It cannot be found. So you must submit your podcast to these directories, because they will then distribute your podcast on their platform so people can actually find your podcast and listen to it. Now, one important thing you need to remember is that you must do step number 8, which is uploading your episodes to your podcast host before you can submit your podcast to these podcast directories. Most directories, if not all of them, will require you to have at least one episode uploaded to your podcasting host before you can submit your podcast for approval, so your podcast can actually show up on their platform. And the top 3 platforms that you absolutely want to be on are, in this order, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Step number 10. Once you submit your podcast to those directories in step number 9, your podcast is basically available for people to listen to. So now is the time to let people know, your family, your friends, your email lists, your customers, let them know that you have a podcast. It might be a good idea to send out an email and that communication ahead of time so that you can actually garner that interest and get people to start listening to your podcast and raise it up in the rankings, and maybe even let the algorithm know that, hey, this podcast is very fun and it's being listened to. Another thing you need to keep in mind, which is very important when you're launching, is you want to make sure that you launch with more than one episode, right? You want to launch with at a minimum 3 episodes and have another one in queue or more in queue. This is important because when people find your podcast, they might like it. They might want to listen to more. And for them to trust you, to know that you will stick around and not give up on your podcast, they might want to see 2, 3, 4 episodes before they can actually commit and become subscribers and followers of your podcast. Let's do a quick recap of the 10 steps of launching your podcast. Step number 1, we talked about picking your topic. Step number 2, get your podcast details right. Step number 3, get your podcast equipment figured out. Step number 4, find guests, and this is optional if you are doing a solo podcast. Step number 5, record your episodes. Step number 6, edit your recorded episodes. Step number 7, get a podcast hosting platform. Step number 8, upload your episodes to your host. Step number 9, submit your podcast to the podcast directories. And step number 10, launch your podcast. And that is how you start a podcast. By the way, if you need help launching your podcast, I have a free training that you can check out in the description. But I also have a self-paced course and other services, including a done-for-you service. And I will leave the link in the chat for those of you who are interested in checking out the free training or the self-paced course or the done-for-you services. By the way, if the information that I shared in this video helped you, subscribe to the channel and like the video so that others may discover the channel and learn more from the content that I share. Thank you very much. See you in the next video. Ciao.